In front of the entire kingdom they called her unworthy. Her groom rejected her at the altar, shaming her for a body he called imperfect, leaving her utterly ruined. Even her own family abandoned her. There was no hope. But they made one fatal mistake. They humiliated her in front of the one man who saw not a flaw, but a queen, and the price he would pay to claim her was a debt her enemies would repay in blood and tears. The air in the grand chapel of Stonehall was as cold as the marble. Saints staring down from the walls. It was a coldness that had little to do with the autumn chill outside. It seeped from the very stones, from the stiff posture of the courtiers packed into the pews, and from the heart of the man waiting at the altar. Lady Anya of Silver Creek felt it settle deep in her bones, a familiar yet unwelcome companion. She stood beside Lord Valerius, her intended, the man whose name and title would finally wash away the stain of her family's new money. All she had to do was breathe, smile, and become his wife. Her father, Lord Olin, had called it a triumph, the greatest match of the generation. Valerius was the Baron of Stonehall, a man whose lineage was as old as the kingdom itself, whose features were so perfectly chiseled he looked like one of the chapel's statues brought to life. Anya, however, knew the truth. His lands were failing, his coffers were empty, and his ancient name was the only currency he had left. Her dowry was the true prize, a fortune in gold and trade agreements that would save his barony from ruin. She was merely the vessel that carried it. She risked a glance at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to meet hers. He had not looked at her once since she joined him at the altar. He radiated a displeasure so profound it was almost a physical force, pushing her away. She had grown used to it over the months of their betrothal, the subtle sneers, the way his hand would retract if hers brushed against it, the careful distance he always kept, as if her very presence might somehow tarnish his polished perfection. The priest, an ancient man with a voice like rustling parchment, began the rites. His words droned on, a meaningless litany that faded into the background of Anya's thoughts. She focused on the heavy tapestry behind the altar, a depiction of a great hunt, with slender lords and ladies chasing a cornered stag. She knew the feeling. All her life she had been cornered by the fast expectations of others, her worth measured not by her sharp mind or her quiet resilience, but by the curve of her waist and the fullness of her face. In a court that valued women who looked as though they might be carried away by a strong breeze, Anya was an oak tree in a garden of delicate lilies, strong, rooted, and entirely out of place. "Do you, Lord Valerius of Stonehall, take this woman, Lady Anya of Silver Creek, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the priest asked, his voice echoing in the sudden, profound silence. This was the moment, the culmination of her father's ambitions and her own resigned duty. Valerius turned, and for the first time he looked directly at her. There was no warmth in his eyes, no flicker of affection. There was only a cold, calculating cruelty. A faint, contemptuous smile played on his lips. He let the silence stretch, a palpable thing that grew heavier with each passing second. He drew in a breath, not to speak his vows, but to command the attention of every soul in the room. "No," he said. The word was not a shout, but a clean, sharp blade that sliced through the chapel's silence. Gasps rippled through the pews. The priest froze, his mouth agape. Valerius's gaze swept over Anya, from her carefully arranged hair down to the hem of her expensive gown. A slow, insulting appraisal. "I sought an alliance with Silver Creek to save my house," he announced, his voice ringing with aristocratic disdain. "I did not, however, agree to tether my noble bloodline to a sow." The world stopped. The air left Anya's lungs in a silent gasp. A wave of heat washed over her, so intense she thought she might faint. A sow. He had called her a sow. In front of the king's court, her family and the foreign dignitaries invited to witness their union. A low murmur spread through the crowd, a mix of shock and poorly concealed amusement. From the front pew, she could see Valerius's mother, the Dowager Duchess Isolane, hiding a triumphant smirk behind her fan. This was her doing. Anya saw it in the woman's venomous eyes. "I cannot wed this abundance," Valerius finished, gesturing to Anya with a flick of his wrist, as if dismissing a servant. He turned his back on her, facing the stunned priest. "The engagement is broken. The match is void." Humiliation was a physical entity, a monstrous weight pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She stood frozen, a statue of shame, at the altar of her own destruction. She looked desperately to her father, her last hope, praying for him to defend her, to rage at this monstrous insult. Lord Olen's face was pale with panic, but it was not anger she saw there. It was fear, fear of losing the social standing he so craved. He scrambled from his seat, not to his daughter's side, but to Valerius's. "My lord, a misunderstanding, surely," he stammered, his hands fluttering nervously. "A poor jest. She is a fine girl, a bit robust, perhaps, but of good stock." The second betrayal was sharper than the first. The man who should have been her shield was apologizing for her very existence. The last pillar of her world crumbled into dust. She was utterly, irrevocably alone. Across the chapel, seated with a quiet intensity that defied the court's decadent frivolity, sat the delegation from the Frostfang Peaks. The northerners were a stark contrast to the silks and velvets of Iridia, clad in dark leathers and heavy wools. Their leader, Kyle, the Wolf Lord, had watched the entire exchange without a flicker of emotion on his scarred face. He was a formidable presence, a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very mountains he ruled. His eyes were not on the triumphant Valerius or her groveling father. They were fixed on her, while the rest of the court saw a ruined woman, an object of pity and scorn. His gaze was different. There was no pity in it. There was no amusement. There was only a cold, unnerving focus, an analytical stillness that seemed to peel back the layers of her shame and see something else beneath. As her father's men moved to escort her away from the altar and hide her from sight, a pariah in her own wedding gown, she saw the Wolf Lord lean forward slightly, his unreadable eyes following her every step. The doors of the chapel closed, plunging her into the shadows, but the memory of that intense, calculating gaze burned in her mind. The heavy oak door of the antechamber slammed shut, the sound echoing the closing of a tomb. Anya was shoved inside, stumbling on the hem of her wedding gown, a dress that now felt like a cruel joke, a shroud of white silk and broken promises. The room was small and airless, filled with discarded candelabras and dusty tapestries. It was a place for forgotten things, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that she was now one of them. She stood trembling in the center of the room, the mocking laughter from the chapel still ringing in her ears. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally the lock scraped, and the door flew open again. It was her father, Lord Olen, his face a blotchy canvas of fury and humiliation. He did not look at her with sympathy. He looked at her as if she were the source of all his woes, a flawed product that had failed its purpose. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He advanced on her, his finger jabbing at the air. "Did you displease him? Were you not demure enough? A man like Valerius requires a gentle hand, a quiet spirit. I told you this. I warned you." The injustice of it was a fresh wound, atop the gaping one Valerius had inflicted. She found a sliver of her voice, a dry whisper. "I did nothing. He simply did not want me." "He did not want you?" Her father scoffed, his laugh a harsh, grating sound. "Of course he did not want you, but he needed your dowry. Your one function, your single purpose in this arrangement, was to be palatable enough for him to stomach for the sake of his finances. And you could not even manage that." Each word was a stone, building a wall around her heart. This was not her protector. This was her accuser. "The dowry must be returned," he continued, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Every last coin. The trade agreements are void. The Silver Creek name is a laughingstock from the capital to the coast. All my work, all my planning, undone in a single afternoon because my own daughter could not secure a desperate man." He stopped and stared at her, his eyes Cold and hard, the moment of her sentencing had arrived. There is only one way to manage this disgrace. You will be out of sight, out of mind. Anya's blood ran cold. What are you going to do? You will be sent to the Silent Sisters convent in the Grey Mountains. You will leave at first light. It is a place for women without prospects, a place of quiet repentance. You will spend the rest of your days there, praying for the honor of the family you have so thoroughly destroyed. The Silent Sisters. It was a place spoken of only in whispers, a remote, wind-swept prison of stone where noble families sent their inconvenient women, daughters who were too defiant, wives who were unfaithful, and now brides who were publicly rejected. It was a life sentence, a living death. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Father, please." "Do not father me," he snarled. "You are no longer my concern. You are a problem to be disposed of." He turned to leave, his hand on the door. Guard will be posted. Do not try to leave. Do not cause any more trouble." The door shut again. This time, the sound of the heavy iron key turning in the lock was loud, deliberate, and final. Anya was now a prisoner in all but name, her fate decided by the men who were supposed to protect her. In that moment, she was the loneliest soul in the kingdom of Viridia, a forgotten note in a grand symphony of power. Across the world, many watch stories like hers unfold from their own quiet corners. Let us know from which kingdom you are watching her fate unfold. For as far as she knew, no one in this world was on her side. She slid down the rough stone wall, her knees giving way. The magnificent dress, a creation that had cost a fortune and taken a team of seamstresses months to perfect, pulled around her on the filthy floor like a milky shroud. The shock that had held her rigid now receded, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. Despair, cold, and absolute, washed over her. Valerius's cruelty had been a swift, public execution. Her father's betrayal was a slow, private poison that was now seeping into every part of her being. She had tried so hard to be what they wanted. She had starved herself for weeks leading up to the wedding, hoping to appear more delicate. She had memorized the lineages of every noble family, practiced the courtly arts, and silenced her own sharp wit, all to be the perfect, acceptable bride. It was all for nothing. Her worth was not something she could earn. It was something they had decided she simply did not possess. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with silent, tearless sobs. There was no one to hear them anyway. There was no one coming to save her. The future was no longer a path, but a wall, gray stone, cold winds, and silence. The Wolf Lord's intense gaze felt like a memory from another life, a meaningless flicker in a world that had now gone completely dark. It was over. She was a forgotten thing in a forgotten room, waiting for the dawn that would begin her long, slow descent into nothingness. The great hall of Stonehall was a theater of exquisite tension. The grand wedding feast lay untouched on long tables, a banquet for ghosts. A nervous energy crackled beneath the forced pleasantries as Lord Valerius and Lord Olin moved through the crowd of nobles, their faces masks of strained composure. They were attempting the impossible, to stitch together the tatters of their dignity. The air was thick with whispers, the courtiers dissecting the afternoon's drama with predatory glee. Finally, Valerius, ever the performer, clapped his hands for silence. He stood on the dais, a portrait of false sincerity. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "While today's events were unorthodox, I wish to clarify, after deep reflection, my sweet lady Anya has decided to pursue a higher calling." He paused, letting the lie settle. "She has chosen to dedicate her life to the faith and will be joining the pious Silent Sisters. We wish her well on her spiritual journey." A murmur of feigned sympathy passed through the crowd. It was a plausible lie, a neat and tidy way to dispose of the scandal. Lord Olin nodded vigorously, his expression one of paternal pride, a performance so false it was grotesque. Anya was not a person. She was a narrative to be managed, a problem to be erased. Then a new voice, deep and resonant as a war drum, cut through the hall. "You are a fool." All heads turned. Kyle, the Wolf Lord, stepped away from the shadows where he had been observing the charade. He moved with a predator's grace, his presence commanding the space around him. His northern warriors shifted behind him, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. The court's nervous chatter died instantly. Kale's cold eyes pinned Valerius to the spot. "You stand in a hall groaning with food, in a land of soft grass and gentle rain, and you mistake a healthy harvest for a blemish. You see a woman of substance and call it a flaw." He took another step forward, his gaze sweeping over the pale, slender women of the Viridian court. "In my land the winter winds bite deep. The snows can bury a house. A lean season means death. My people do not see with the eyes of pampered southern lords. We see strength. We see a woman who can bear strong children and lead a household through a long winter." His eyes found Lord Olin. "We see a queen." Lord Olin paled, stammering, "My lord, this is a private family matter." "You made it a public matter when you allowed this boy to humiliate her," Kyle countered, his voice sharp with contempt. He reached into a pouch at his belt and threw a heavy, clinking bag onto the floor at Olin's feet. It was followed by another and another. "This is the bride price. 10,000 gold sovereigns. Not for you," he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "but for her, to be her own. An apology from the men of this kingdom who clearly do not recognize a treasure when it stands before them." The hall erupted. 10,000 sovereigns was a king's ransom, a fortune that could buy a dozen baronies like Stonehall. It was an offer so extravagant it was a public condemnation, a declaration that Valerius had not just rejected a woman, but a priceless treasure. Valerius, his face purple with rage, sputtered, "You cannot. She is disgraced. She is going to the convent." Kale gave a humorless smile. "She is going nowhere. Your father's guards have her locked in the west antechamber." He nodded to two of his largest warriors. "Fix that." Before the Stonehall guards could react, the two Northmen were moving, their purpose clear and unstoppable. Panic ensued. Olin shouted for his guards, but they were hesitant, unwilling to challenge the formidable warriors. The scene cut back to the dusty chamber where Anya sat in a heap of despair. She heard the commotion from the hall, the shouting, the heavy thud of the coin purses, the deep, commanding voice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. Fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through her grief. Were they coming to drag her to the convent now, in the middle of the feast, to complete the spectacle? The footsteps thundering down the corridor were heavy, purposeful. They stopped outside her door. She scrambled backwards, pressing herself against the far wall as the lock rattled violently. Then came a sound like a thunderclap as the thick oak door splintered and burst inward. Anya flinched, expecting to see her father's angry guards, but the man who filled the doorway was a giant, a warrior from the Frostfang Peaks. Behind him stood his leader. Kyle, the Wolf Lord, stepped over the wreckage of the door, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway. He took in the scene in an instant. The small, dirty room, the ruined wedding dress, the woman on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. His expression remained unreadable, but the fire in his eyes seemed to soften for a fraction of a second. With a flick of his hand, he dismissed the warrior. He walked slowly toward Anya, his steps sure and silent on the stone floor. He was even more intimidating up close, a mountain of a man, scarred by battles she could not imagine. He knelt before her, not on one knee like a courtier, but crouching down to her level like a predator studying its prey. She held her breath, expecting a blow, an insult, a rough hand. Instead, his voice was surprisingly low and steady, devoid of either pity or cruelty. "Lady Anya," he said, the sound rumbling in his chest, "Lord Valerius of Stonehall is a blind man. I am not." He rose to his full, towering height, looking down at her. For a moment she thought he would offer a hand, but he did something far more shocking. In one fluid motion he bent and scooped her up into his arms. She gave a small cry of alarm, She was not a small woman, but he lifted her as if she were a child. Her silk dress, rustling against his hard leather armor, held securely against his chest. She looked up into his fierce, unblinking eyes. "You were meant to be a queen today," he stated, his voice a raw promise. "You still will be, my queen." Without another word, he turned and carried her out of her prison, through the corridor and back into the great hall. A sea of faces, pale with shock and disbelief, parted before them. He did not stop, his gaze fixed on the main doors, his stride unbroken. Anya, cradled in the arms of this terrifying stranger, looked over his shoulder at the stunned faces of her father and the man who had rejected her. They looked small, powerless, and utterly insignificant. Her life had been stolen from her twice in one day, first by rejection, now by claim. She had no idea if this was a rescue or simply a new, more brutal kind of cage awaiting her in the frozen lands of the north. The journey from the great hall of Stonehall to the northern encampment was a blur of shocked faces and trampled finery. Cale moved through the chaos as if it were parting for him, a force of nature that would not be denied. Anya, held tight against his chest, felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a profound detachment. She had been cast out of her world so completely that watching it shatter in the wake of her departure felt distant, as if happening to someone else. His camp was a circle of dark, formidable tents pitched just beyond the castle's outer walls, a stark and martial contrast to Stonehall's manicured lawns. He carried her into the largest tent, the command post, and the scent of wood smoke, oiled leather, and pine instantly enveloped her. He finally set her down on a thick pile of wolf pelts, his movements surprisingly gentle. The tent was Spartan but functional, dominated by a large table covered in maps, with axes and swords leaning against the central pole. This was a place of work, of war. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. The shock began to recede, and in its place a hot spark of defiance ignited within Anya. She would not be a passive prize, traded from one man to another. She straightened her back, ignoring the disarray of her gown. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "Am I your prisoner, a spoil of war to be paraded before your people?" Cale regarded her, his head tilted. "A prisoner does not sit on a throne," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "I told you, I need a queen." "Why?" she pressed, crossing her arms. "Because you felt some misplaced pity? Because you wished to make a point to the southern lords?" "Pity is a luxury my people cannot afford," he said, moving to the map table. "And the opinions of southern lords are worth less than the dirt under my boots. I acted because I saw an opportunity they were too blind to seize." He looked at her directly, his gaze intense. "I saw you?" "At the altar. While that peacock preened and your father trembled, you stood your ground. You did not cry or plead. You absorbed the blow. There is a spine of steel in you, Lady Anya, whether you know it or not. My kingdom has no use for a fragile flower. It needs an oak tree that will not break in the storm." His words, so different from the flowery, backhanded compliments of the Viridian court, struck a chord deep inside her. He was not praising her beauty or her grace. He was praising her endurance. He gestured dismissively toward the castle. "I came here to secure a trade treaty. Stonehall has timber and grain that we need to supplement our own stores before winter. But your Lord Valerius is an incompetent negotiator. He undervalues his own assets and does not even understand the best routes to transport them." He scoffed. "He tried to sell me lumber from the Blackwood Forest, insisting on using the old river road to transport it." Anya's mind, a place she had so often retreated to, suddenly whirred to life. The numbers, the maps, the ledgers her father had let her study. It all clicked into place. "The Blackwood is a fool's bargain," she said, stepping forward. Cale raised an eyebrow. "The timber there is old and prone to rot," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "The best wood is from the eastern ridge, a grove Valerius's grandfather logged a century ago and has since regrown. It is twice the quality." She moved toward the table, her finger hovering over the map. And the old river road will flood in the autumn rains. He would lose a quarter of the shipment. The northern pass is longer, but it is safer and faster if you have the right wagons. You would save 2 weeks and all of your cargo. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. Valerius does not know this. He has never bothered to learn his own lands. A slow, genuine smile spread across Kyle's face for the first time. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a startling warmth. He was not just surprised. He was deeply, profoundly impressed. He looked at her now, not as a damsel in distress, but as an unexpected, formidable weapon. In that moment, a new power was forged in the flickering firelight of the barbarian's tent. Not of steel, but of mind, not of conquest, but of mutual respect. A king had found his queen, and a queen had found her weapon. If you believe a sharp mind is the most dangerous weapon of all, hit the like button to show your support for their new alliance. I knew there was a fire in you, Kyle said, his voice laced with admiration. I did not realize it could forge steel. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his expression turning serious. This changes things. I did not bring you here to be a mere figurehead, Lady Anya. I offer you a true pact, an alliance. An alliance? She repeated, her mind racing. Yes, he said, his eyes burning with intensity. Your family and your former groom cast you out. They tried to bury you. With my armies and my resources at your command, we can give them a war they cannot win, but not a war of swords. He tapped the map. A war of coin and grain, of trade and timber. We will dismantle their houses from the inside out, using the very knowledge they scorned you for possessing. Help me make my kingdom the strongest in the north, he offered, his voice a low, dangerous promise, and I will help you grind theirs to dust. Anya looked at the powerful man before her, at the raw determination in his face, and saw her path forward. It was not a path to a quiet convent, but a road to glorious, satisfying justice. The fear that had paralyzed her was burning away, replaced by a cold, sharp, and exhilarating sense of purpose. She had been given a weapon, and she would wield it without mercy. You have a deal, my lord, she said, her voice clear and firm. When do we begin? The journey north was a baptism by ice and wind. The soft, rolling hills of Viridia gave way to jagged peaks that clawed at the sky, their slopes thick with ancient, snow-dusted pines. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of cold stone and freedom. Anya had expected the Frostfang Peaks to be a desolate, colorless wasteland. Instead, she found a world of stark, breathtaking beauty. The sky was a deeper blue than she had ever seen. The rivers ran with water so clear it was like liquid crystal, and the silence was a living thing, broken only by the cry of an eagle or the distant howl of a wolf. Kale's fortress, Castle Volkov, was not a place of elegant spires and delicate gardens like Stonehall. It was a bastion of raw power, carved into the side of a mountain, its dark stone walls seeming to grow from the rock itself. Inside, there were no silken tapestries or fragile ornaments. The halls were warmed by massive, roaring hearths, the floors covered in the thick pelts of wolves and bears, and the walls decorated with shields and axes that were not heirlooms, but weapons that had seen recent use. It was a place built for survival, not for show, and for the first time in her life, Anya felt she could breathe. Her days took on a new rhythm. She was given chambers with a hearth that never went out, and a window that looked out over a vast, snow-covered valley. The northern women, tall and strong, with braids of silver and gold, did not look at her with pity or scorn. They looked at her with curiosity, and when they saw Kale's favor, with respect. They taught her how to stitch leather, how to identify edible mountain herbs, and how to walk on snow without sinking. They valued what a person could do, not how they appeared. But it was the nights that truly defined her new life. After the fortress had settled into a quiet hum, she would join Kyle in his strategy room. It was a space that had become their sanctuary, their war room. With charcoal and parchment, Anya painstakingly recreated the ledgers and maps she held in her eidetic memory. The complex web of Commerce that fueled the southern kingdoms was laid bare on the great oak table between them. "My father's wealth isn't in his lands," she explained one evening, her finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map. "It's in his contracts. He has the exclusive rights to ship ironwood timber from the Duke of Ashworth to the royal shipyards. The route is precarious, and he charges the crown a fortune for the risk." Cale leaned over the map, his presence a warm, solid wall beside her. "And the risk is a lie," Anya said, a cold smile touching her lips. "He uses the dangerous Serpent's Pass, but he secretly pays the mountain clans there for safe passage. The Duke of Ashworth doesn't know. The king doesn't know. Only my father. And now, us." Cale's eyes glinted in the firelight. "If those payments were to stop, the clans would raid the next shipment," Anya finished. "My father's reputation with the crown would be ruined, and he would be liable for the lost cargo. It would cripple him." This was how their vengeance took shape. It was not a single brutal blow, but 1,000 calculated cuts. They planned to bleed their enemies dry, slowly and methodically. For Lord Valerius, the attack was even more direct. "Stonehall's economy is built on a single pillar, grain," Anya stated, pointing to the fertile land surrounding the barony. "He sells his surplus to the eastern towns, and that income pays his soldiers and maintains his castle. But he is lazy. He uses only one merchant guild, the House of Gable, to manage his sales." "We can outbid them," Cale said, his mind immediately grasping the strategy. "We don't have to," Anya countered. "The head of the guild is a greedy man named Marius. I know for a fact he has been skimming from Valerius for years. We will send an agent to him. We will offer him a better deal, to buy Stonehall's grain through him at a slightly higher price, but pay him directly in untraceable gold. He will sell us the grain meant for the eastern towns, report a poor harvest to Valerius, and keep the difference. Valerius will be starved of income, and his own agent will be the one holding the knife." As they plotted, a new intimacy grew between them. It was not the soft, cloying romance of Southern songs, but something forged in the heat of shared purpose. He began to see her not just as a woman he had saved, but as his most brilliant commander. He would watch, fascinated, as she dismantled the economies of her enemies with the precision of a master strategist. He started calling her his Wolf Queen in front of his council, and the name stuck. It was a title she wore with a pride she had never known. One night, as she worked late over the maps, he placed a heavy fur cloak over her shoulders. It was the pelt of a massive snow wolf, white as the driven snow and impossibly soft. "The nights are colder here," he said simply. She pulled the fur tighter around her, the warmth a welcome comfort. "Thank you, my lord." "Kyle," he corrected her gently. "My name is Kyle." He looked at her, his expression serious. "In the South, they value women for the beauty of their face. It is a foolish measure. Beauty fades. A mind like yours can build an empire or bring one to its knees." No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked past her appearance to see the true value of her mind. In that moment, surrounded by maps of war and plans for revenge, Anya felt the last of her old self, the shamed and broken girl from the chapel, fall away. A queen was being forged in the heart of the mountains. Their plan was complete. The agents had been dispatched. The gold had been allocated. The first move was about to be made. Anya stood with Kyle on a balcony overlooking the moonlit valley, the cold air sharp in her lungs. Down in the south, her enemies slept soundly, secure in their arrogance, completely unaware that winter was coming for them. And it was a winter of her making. As the first deep snows of winter blanketed the frost-fanged peaks, turning Castle Volkov into a silent white fortress, the first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt in the south. The seeds of ruin, planted by a queen's sharp mind and watered by a king's resources, had begun to sprout. In Viridia, where the autumn was mild and the sun still shone, a cold, unnatural winter was descending upon two noble houses, and they had no idea from which direction the storm was coming. The first strike was surgical. In a dimly lit tavern in the market town bordering Stonehall. A quiet, unassuming man named Fenn, Cale's most trusted agent, met with Marius Gable. Marius was a merchant of middling success and immense greed, the man Lord Valerius entrusted with his entire harvest. Fenn laid a small but heavy purse of gold on the table between them. "My master in the north has new settlements. They need grain," Fenn said, his voice a low murmur. "He is willing to pay a premium, directly to the man who can procure it to avoid the ridiculous tariffs and taxes of the southern lords." Marius's beady eyes darted to the purse, then around the tavern. He understood the offer immediately. He would sell the bulk of Stonehall's harvest to this mysterious northern lord, report a catastrophic crop failure to Valerius, and pocket a fortune that Valerius would never know existed. He wet his lips. "The harvest has been poor this season," he said, testing the lie. "Very poor." Fenn smiled faintly. "My master is prepared to be most generous for what little can be salvaged." The deal was done. A week later, in the great hall of Stonehall, Lord Valerius paced furiously before his throne. The hall felt emptier now. Several of the grand tapestries had been sold, and fewer servants walked the halls. Marius Gable stood before him, his face a mask of sorrowful sympathy. "A blight, my lord," Marius explained, wringing his hands. "And then the early rains. We were able to salvage less than a third of the crop. It is a disaster across the entire region." "A disaster?" Valerius raged. "The income from that grain was meant to pay the garrison for the next 6 months. Am I to be protected by scarecrows?" He was trapped. To question Marius, his agent of 10 years, would be to admit his own ignorance of his lands. He waved a dismissive hand. "Get out. See what you can fetch for the scraps." The second strike landed on Lord Olin of Silver Creek. A messenger, breathless and mud-splattered, arrived at his sub. Manor with devastating news. The ironwood shipment, the single most profitable contract of his career, had been lost. "Lost?" Olin roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He stared at the letter in his trembling hand. "Attacked in the Serpent's Pass, my lord," the messenger stammered. "The mountain clans. They descended without warning. The guards were overwhelmed. They burned the cargo and slaughtered the oxen. There is nothing left." Olin swept a silver goblet from his desk, sending it crashing against the stone wall. The mountain clans had been peaceful for years, pacified by his regular secret payments. For them to attack now, without reason, was impossible. He could not tell the Duke or the King that his security was a sham. He was ruined. The cost of the lost cargo, combined with the penalties for a failed delivery, would erase nearly half his fortune. He sank into his chair, his mind reeling, desperately trying to find an enemy to blame, never once thinking of the daughter he had exiled. Back in the quiet, fire-lit strategy room of Castle Volkov, Anya read the reports from Fenn with a steady hand. There was no wild joy in her, no triumphant laughter. There was only the cold, deep satisfaction of a complex equation being solved perfectly. She had predicted every move, every reaction. She had turned her father's greed and Valerius's arrogance against them like finely honed weapons. Kyle watched her from across the room. He saw the focused intensity in her eyes, the firm set of her jaw. This was the woman he had seen at the altar, the one who absorbed the blow without shattering. Now she was the one delivering the blows, and she did so with a chilling precision. He came and stood behind her, placing his large hands on her shoulders, a silent acknowledgment of their shared victory. She did not flinch or startle. She simply leaned back slightly, accepting his presence, his support. They were a single unit, a two-headed sovereign of vengeance. The weeks that followed saw the cracks in Stonehall and Silver Creek widen into chasms. Valerius, his income gone, was forced to dismiss half of his household guard. The remaining soldiers grew resentful as their pay was delayed. The common folk began to murmur as food prices in the market crept ever higher. For Lord Olin, ships sat idle in the port as he failed to secure new contracts, his reputation for reliability now in tatters. The final scene of their undoing began in Stonehall's solar. Valerius was in a heated argument with his mother, the Dowager Duchess Isoline. "We have nothing left to sell," he yelled, gesturing around the room. "The treasury is empty." Isoline, her face a mask of bitter resentment, looked at her son with contempt. "Then you must beg," she hissed. "There is new power in the north. That barbarian lord who stole your bride is said to be expanding his kingdom. He is rich. Go to him." "Go to," Valerius sputtered, horrified, "to Kale. After what he did? He shamed me. He took that fat cow and called her a queen. I would rather starve." "And you will," his mother snapped, her voice like ice. "Your pride has already cost us everything. Swallow it, or we will have nothing left but this cold, empty castle and a name no one fears any more. Go north. Flatter the barbarian. Plead for a loan. It is our only hope." Valerius stared into the fire, his handsome face contorted with hate and humiliation. To travel to the Frostfang Peaks, to kneel before the man who held his rejected bride, was a fate worse than death. But as he looked at the growing desperation in his mother's eyes and felt the cold dread of his own empty pockets, he knew she was right. It was his only move. He was a cornered stag, and his only path of escape led directly into the wolf's den. The journey north was a pilgrimage of shame for Lord Valerius. Every league that took him further from the rolling hills of Viridia and deeper into the stark, imposing grandeur of the Frostfang Peaks felt like another step toward his own damnation. He and his small, shivering retinue were met at the base of the mountain by a party of Kale's warriors. They were not hostile, but their stoic silence and intimidating presence were unnerving. They led him up the winding path to Castle Volkov, a fortress that seemed less built and more unleashed from the mountain's heart. Valerius had expected a crude, barbaric hall filled with drunken savages. Instead, he was led into a space of formidable, clean-lined power. The great hall was vast and warm, lit by the glow of a dozen hearths. Polished shields and axes adorned the stone walls, and at the far end, on a dais carved from dark mountain rock, sat 2 thrones. On the larger throne sat Kyle, the Wolf Lord, looking every bit the Mountain King, his presence as solid and unyielding as the stone around him. But it was the woman beside him who drew Valerius's eye. She was breathtaking, draped in the pristine white pelt of a snow wolf with her dark hair intricately braided with threads of silver. She possessed a regal confidence that radiated from her like heat from a fire. There was a sharpness in her intelligent eyes and a serene, powerful set to her mouth. She was no delicate southern flower. She was a queen, forged in ice and stone. Valerius felt a pang of envy. Of course, the barbarian would find a creature of such wild, intimidating beauty to share his throne. He approached the dais and performed the customary bow, his movements stiff with resentment. "Lord Kale," he began, his voice tight, "I thank you for granting me an audience. I have traveled far to discuss matters of mutual interest between our lands." Kale regarded him with an unreadable expression, his silence a weapon in itself. He did not speak, but gestured with one hand toward the queen beside him. It was she who would hear his plea. Valerius turned his attention to the woman. He offered her his most charming smile, the one that had wooed countless ladies at court. "My lady queen, I am Lord Valerius of Stonehall. My lands have fallen on hard times, a series of misfortunes. I come to you today to propose a partnership, a loan, to be repaid with interest, to see my people through this difficult winter." The queen listened patiently, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her gaze was steady and disconcertingly direct. When he finished, she did not reply immediately. She let the silence hang in the air, a subtle mimicry of the way he had once let the silence stretch in the chapel. "Misfortunes, Lord Valerius?" she asked, her voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the vast hall. It was a voice that held a strange, distant familiarity that he couldn't quite place. "Tell me of these misfortunes." Eager to garner sympathy, Valerius launched into his tale of woe. "A terrible blight ruined our harvest," he lamented, "and the trade routes have become unsafe. Pirates and bandits plague our merchants. It is as if the gods themselves have turned their faces from us." The queen tilted her head, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. The gods can be fickle, but sometimes, my lord, our misfortunes are not the work of gods, but of men. Are you certain your house is in order? Are you certain your agents are loyal? Do you even know the true worth of your own lands? Her questions were sharp, precise, and unnervingly accurate. They hinted at a knowledge no outsider should possess. Valerius felt a prickle of unease. I do not take your meaning, my lady. Don't you? The queen rose from her throne and descended the steps of the dais, her movements fluid and deliberate. As she drew closer, the firelight caught the features of her face, and the unsettling familiarity of her voice finally struck Valerius with the force of a physical blow. The confidence was new, the regal bearing was new, but the eyes, he knew those eyes. His mind reeled, refusing to accept what was before him. It was impossible. The woman he had cast aside, the fat, plain girl from Silver Creek, could not be this magnificent, powerful creature. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the cold fire burning in her gaze. "You seek grain, Lord Valerius?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that was for him alone. The man who worried about tethering his noble bloodline to a sow now comes to my court to beg for a harvest? Recognition crashed over him. His face, already pale from the cold, drained of all remaining color. His mouth fell open, and a strangled, incoherent sound escaped his throat. It was her. It was Anya. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. He looked from her to Cale, who now wore an expression of grim satisfaction. The entire court, the warriors, the servants, all watched in silence. They had known all along this was not an audience, it was a judgment. The entire scene had been orchestrated for his ultimate humiliation. Anya stood before him, no longer the trembling victim at the altar, but the architect of his doom. The power in the room was hers, absolute and undeniable. "You rejected me because you thought I was worthless," she said, her voice ringing with the strength of forged steel. "You and my father cast me out, believing your power was absolute. But you are not powerful, my lord. You are merely arrogant, and your arrogance has delivered you and everything you hold dear directly into my hands." He stared at her, speechless. The woman he had tried to erase had become his undoing. The world had not just turned upside pasted. It had been remade, with her at its very center. He was no longer a lord begging a loan from a barbarian king. He was a ruined man standing before the queen he had created. Lord Valerius, the man who had stood so tall on the altar of his pride, was now on his knees on the cold stone floor of Castle Volkov. The great hall was silent, every warrior and servant watching as the final act of this grand play for justice unfolded. Anya looked down at him, not with the fiery rage he might have expected, but with the calm, detached authority of a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "I will give you what you came for, Valerius," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I will send enough grain to your lands to see your people through the winter. I am not the monster you are. I will not let the innocent suffer for the crimes of their lord." A flicker of desperate hope sparked in Valerius's eyes. "Thank you, my queen," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I am forever in your—" "I am not finished," Anya cut him off, her tone sharp as ice, extinguishing the spark instantly. "This aid comes at a price. My price." She began to walk slowly around him, her wolf-pelt cloak whispering against the floor. "Your first crime against me was one of public humiliation. Your punishment, therefore, will be public disgrace. You will write a full confession addressed to King Alistair himself. In it, you will detail your cruelty at the altar, your mother's part in the scheme, and your gross incompetence in managing your own lands. You will make it clear that you rejected an alliance that would have saved you, all for the sake of your own vanity." Valerius looked up, horrified. "That would ruin me. My name—" "Your name is already worthless," Anya stated flatly. "This merely makes it official. Secondly, your obsession with your title and lands has led you here. So you will give them up." She stopped in front of him. "You will sign the deed and title to the barony of Stonehall over to me. It is my property now. You will be permitted to live in the gatehouse, a guest on my lands, surviving on a stipend I provide. You, who were so ashamed to be seen with me, will now live because of my charity." The poetic cruelty of the terms was breathtaking. He would be stripped of everything he valued, forced to live as a landless dependent, under the authority of the woman he had deemed worthless. "And what of my father?" Anya continued, her voice hardening as she spoke of the second betrayal. "His crime was valuing coin and status above his own blood, so his coin and status will now belong to me." She turned her gaze to the hall at large. "Let it be known that the recent misfortunes of Lord Olin of Silver Creek were also of my design. I intercepted his contracts and bled his coffers dry. I will now offer to save his house by purchasing all his debts and absorbing his entire trade company into a new guild under my name. He will work for me. He will answer to me. The daughter he sold will now be the master he serves." A warrior brought a small table, a quill, and 2 documents, a confession already drafted, and the deed to Stonehall. With a scratch of a quill, a lifetime of injustice was answered. The accounts were settled not with swords, but with ink and consequence. A woman's pain had been forged into a ruler's decree. Justice, when it finally arrives, can reshape the world. If this moment of reckoning sent a shiver down your spine, subscribe to witness the new world Anya and Cale will build from the ashes of the old. Valerius stared at the papers, his body trembling. It was his entire world, his identity, his future, condensed onto 2 pieces of parchment. He looked up at Anya, at her unyielding expression, and then at Cale, who watched him with undisguised contempt. He had no choice. To refuse was to let his people starve and to face ruin anyway. To accept was to at least survive, albeit in a hell of his own making. With a choked sob of utter defeat, he picked up the quill. His hand shook so violently that the first stroke was a jagged, ugly line. He steadied himself, took a deep breath, and signed his name, first on the confession, then on the deed. Each letter was a final nail in the coffin of his life. He pushed the documents away from him as if they were poison. Anya stepped forward and took them, her expression calm as she reviewed his signature. She gave a slight nod. "The grain will be dispatched at dawn," she said, her voice devoid of any triumph. It was simply a statement of fact, the closing of a ledger. She looked at the broken man on the floor. "You may go." Valerius did not seem to hear her at first. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. He looked like an old man, his shoulders slumped, his face a hollow mask of despair. Without another word he turned and stumbled out of the great hall, his small retinue scurrying after him. The heavy doors closed behind him, leaving a profound silence in their wake. The war was over. Anya stood alone in the center of the hall, the papers held loosely in her hand. This was it. The moment she had planned for, the justice she had craved. She had her victory, she had her vengeance. She looked down at the deed to Stonehall, the lands that should have been hers by marriage, now hers by conquest. She had the power, the wealth, and the respect she had never been given. She was free. Kyle came to her side, his presence a warm and solid comfort. He did not speak, simply stood with her in the vast, quiet hall. The cheering of his men had died down, leaving only the crackling of the hearths. The battle was won, but what came after? Her pact of vengeance with this man was fulfilled. She looked up at him, at the king who had given her the world, and for the first time she wondered what exactly they were to each other now. The great hall of Castle Volkov, which had moments before been a stage for absolute justice, was now profoundly quiet. The warriors had retreated, leaving a respectful distance. The servants had cleared away the table and documents, erasing the final traces of the confrontation. All that remained was the crackling of the great hearths and the silent space between Anya and Kyle. The victory felt different than she had imagined, colder, emptier. The fire of her vengeance had burned so brightly that it had consumed everything, and now, in its absence, she felt a hollow ache. Cale stood beside her, his presence a familiar, solid comfort. He had not moved, simply watched as the last remnants of her old life were swept away by her own design. Anya's heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. The words meant to signify victory sounded like a closing chapter. Their pact, the very foundation of her new life, was fulfilled. A cold tendril of fear, a feeling she had not truly felt since that day in the antechamber, curled in her stomach. Was this the end? Now that her enemies were vanquished, was she just a guest in this king's hall? He turned to face her fully, and the unreadable expression that had so often guarded his features was gone. In its place was a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. Our pact was for vengeance. That is done, he affirmed, his eyes searching hers. You are a free woman, Anya, wealthier than your father ever was, more powerful than the Lord who scorned you. The title to Stonehall is yours. The Silver Creek Guild is yours. No one can ever harm you again. He took a step back, a gesture of respect that felt like a chasm opening between them. You can return to the South a queen in your own right. You can rebuild your family's name on your own terms. You can have any life you choose. He paused, and the air grew thick with unspoken meaning, with the weight of the future. Or, he said, his voice dropping, becoming softer, you can stay. The choice hung in the air between them. Stay. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of a kingdom. He was not commanding her. He was not assuming. After everything, after claiming her from the altar and making her his queen, he was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, a true choice. Anya thought of the South. She pictured the rolling green hills, the opulent courts, the scent of rain on damp earth. But the image was tainted. She saw the sneering face of Valerius, the weak trembling of her father, the cruel smiles of the court ladies. It was a place of whispers, judgment, and weakness, a beautiful cage. Then she looked around the great hall of Castle Volkov. She saw the honest, unadorned strength of the stone walls. She felt the fierce, dry heat of the fire. She thought of the northern people, with their straightforward gazes, and their respect for strength over appearance. This was a place of honesty, of substance. It was the first place she had ever felt, truly seen, the first place her mind was valued more than her form. It was the first place she had ever felt safe. She met his gaze, and for the first time she let the wall she kept around her heart dissolve completely. She had come here as part of a bargain, a tool for his kingdom, and a vessel for her own revenge. But somewhere along the way, in the quiet nights spent plotting over maps, in the shared glances of understanding, in the simple gesture of him placing a warm cloak over her shoulders, the alliance had transformed. It had become something more. A slow smile, the same genuine, breathtaking smile she had seen in his tent on their first night, spread across Cale's face. It reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He did not sweep her up as he had before. Instead, he stopped just before her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch gentle, reverent. His calloused fingers gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Anya," he breathed, as if the name itself was a prayer. "I have had you since the moment I saw you stand alone at that altar." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the brutal claiming she had feared, or the dispassionate pecks of courtly betrothals. It was a kiss of profound respect, of deep, soulful connection. It spoke of shared battles, of quiet admiration, and of a future waiting to be built. It was a kiss that sealed, not a bud, pact of vengeance, but a covenant of partnership. It was not a beginning, but a recognition of what had already grown between them in the heart of the winter. Later that night they stood together in the strategy room, the scene of so many of their plans. But the maps were no longer tools of war, they were blueprints for a future. Cale's finger traced a new route on the map, one connecting the resource-rich mountains of the north with the now leaderless but fertile lands of Stonehall. He looked at her, his love and admiration shining in his eyes. The shamed lady and the barbarian lord, the rejected and the savior, were no longer just allies. They were partners, they were equals, they were king and queen, ready to build their new world together. Spring came to the lands of Stonehall and the Frostfang Peaks, not as a gentle visitor, but as a triumphant army, banishing the last remnants of a long, hard winter. The sun thawed the ground, and with it the last vestiges of fear and scarcity that had plagued the barony. Under the joint rule of the Wolf Lord and his queen, the fields were tilled and planted with the grain Anya had provided, and the sounds of hammers and saws echoed from the valley as construction began on the Great Northern Road, the artery that would soon pump unprecedented prosperity into their united kingdom. Stonehall itself was transformed. The cold, oppressive atmosphere of Valerius's reign had evaporated. The halls were now filled with a mix of sturdy northerners and hopeful southerners, their languages and customs blending into a new, vibrant culture. Laughter was heard more often than whispers. Anya stood on a balcony, overlooking the castle's main garden. For months after her arrival, the garden had been left to ruin, a symbol of Valerius's neglect. Now it was her personal project, a riot of life and color. Mountain wildflowers grew alongside southern roses, a testament to the fact that two different worlds could not only coexist, but create something more beautiful together. There was a new serenity to Anya, a deep, quiet confidence that had replaced the sharp edge of her vengeful purpose. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, a silent, profound promise of the future. Kyle came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He followed her gaze to the garden below. "You brought the sun back to this place," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. "You have a gift for making things grow, my queen, whether it is a garden or a kingdom." She leaned back into his embrace, a contented smile on her lips. "I had good soil to work with," she replied softly. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. The girl who was to be married in the chapel would not recognize this garden or herself. From their vantage point, they could see the life of the castle unfolding. Farmers headed to the fields, guards trained in the yard with a mix of southern steel and northern ferocity, and children, both northern and southern, played together near the gate. Far in the distance, a lone figure could be seen walking near the modest gatehouse, a man in simple clothes, his shoulders permanently slumped in defeat. Valerius. He was a ghost in his own ancestral home, a living monument to the folly of pride. Anya felt nothing when she looked at him, not pity, not anger, not even satisfaction. He was simply a part of the past, a closed chapter in a book she had finished reading long ago. Her future was here, standing before her, his arms around her and their child. Her vengeance had given her justice, but it was Kale who had given her a life. He had seen a queen when all others saw a flaw, and in doing so, had given her the power to become who she was always meant to be. He claimed her at the altar to defy a world, but it was she who gave him a kingdom of immeasurable worth. Together, the shamed lady and the Wolf Lord proved that true power is not taken by force, but forged in respect, and that the greatest strength is often found in the hearts that the world has overlooked. If you believe in stories where the silenced find their voice and the forgotten build empires, subscribe to our channel, join us, and never miss a tale of justice, love, and the ultimate triumph of the worthy.